I love video game consoles. They provide the only official way to play Fling Smash. I cannot get enough of how great video game consoles are for society, but there's been one problem that's been plaguing me for years. The SNES is too fat. But I can fix that. I took wizardry in my sophomore year because general paper was for chumps. And so, behold! So that's why my teacher told me to apply myself. Redesigning a video game console is a very interesting decision to make. In what situation would the original console be outclassed? How can you improve upon what's already there while making something that isn't completely different? Great question. Many consoles peak at their first iteration. It's what most people think of when that console comes to mind. Nobody goes, I love the Sega Genesis because it was small and had a big 3 on it. But some consoles are in deep need of a redesign. Anything is better than the first model of the Xbox One. Except for Eviction, the jury's still out on that one. The first version of a console might not work that great. It could be too bulky, or maybe someone said it smelled bad. So making a second version of a console is a good way to get people interested in a console again, making sure that people bought a second Wii because this one was horizontal. And this trend popped up all the way back in the 70s, back when video games were no more entertaining than twiddling your thumbs. This beats Atari by a mile. The Fairchild Channel F System 2. What? Many console redesigns early on acted like they were direct sequels to the original, when in reality, they're just gross, sweatier versions of what the original was, which means Sim was hip even back in the day. But I will say the Fairchild Channel F System 2, aside from being a string of letters I never want to pronounce again, looks like it has a bit more personality than the standard Fairchild Channel F. I can't say anything about the product's quality, do I look like I live here? But it's a better fate than the Intellivision 2. This is just an odd looking thing. The original model looks sturdy and neat. If this showed up to a funeral, it would be met with laughter. And I don't know why, but the Atari 2600 Junior looks like a keyboard with no keys. Looking at it in comparison to the standard 2600, this looks like an actual console. But this was more of a budget choice than anything. If you had the money, you'd probably chalk it up for the standard model, or the Darth Vader model if you were feeling quirky that day. Even though the only difference it has visibly is that it's black. So in this generation in particular, game consoles weren't upgraded to improve on what was already there. They were made for either people who couldn't afford getting the original, or people who were legally blind. This was the generation where Nintendo dominated with the Nintendo Entertainment System, and I can say I'm a fan of this chubby gaming box. The design could be more interesting, but it fits the attitude of the generation. Simple, yet effective. So that's what Clue Land was trying to tell me. And the redesign for the system, it's fine. It happens to be a lot more reliable than the original though. I feel like this thing would give out if I sneezed. The Nes Top Loader, as it's generally referred to as, was way more compact, it was far cheaper, and it could even play PAL games. But it has 2 main problems. Problem 1, I don't own it. Problem 2, it only has RF. You see, while AV ports were biding their time in a retirement home, RF ports have been stuck in the morgue for years. The fact that this only has RF makes it completely useless in the modern day, so it's a good thing I'm stuck in the past. What shakes me even more is that Japan got the exact opposite treatment. Their version of this console was literally called the Famicom AV, and it was a very large part of its branding. So how come we got stiffed? Twice. The Master System 2 was the other redesign this generation. Ew. I can't say I care for how curvy the console looks, it just doesn't look like it has any personality compared to the angular design that I instantly remember. It might have also been a budget redesign, but I think the NES Top Loader was more redeemable because it looked inoffensive, and it was a more reliable option compared to a version of a console that was prone to hardware failure. This can't even play some of the games that were released on cards. Most of the Master System library was on cartridges, but still. Even after this generation, the redesigns of consoles still weren't as worth buying unless you didn't have much of a budget. These designs are iconic, and while their redesigns are fine, you're better off going for the originals. The SNES is one of my favorite retro consoles. It has just about everything I could ask for, like purple. I would never expect the color combination of purple and white to work so well, but it is one of the most standout things about the system, and it's big. I never knew how large this thing was until I got one. It's just so big and bulky. I always liked that about it. It was never ashamed of its weight. I was wrong. The SNES Junior is small, curvy, and weird. My complaints end there. This is a fine enough redesign, but I wouldn't get it unless I found it for a really cheap price. So this is why I'm going bankrupt. The redesigns of a Sega Genesis. Oh no. The Model 2 is functionally the same, with a few things tweaked. I just don't like how it looks that much. It's better than the Model 3 though, because it couldn't get enough of telling you that it was the third one. This thing is tiny, and it doesn't even work with the 32X or CD add-ons, so it looks like scrimp and it can't do much. The Model 3 is just there if you want to make a fashion statement, and no thanks, I got enough weird looks buying this at the thrift store. The running theme from both the second and third generation still stands. These redesigns weren't improvements, they were options, and that only disturbs me because they could have been so much more and so much less. This is the generation that redesigned consoles forgot. There was only one for the PlayStation, the PS1. Not the PS1, the PS1. It's the original model if you wanted a shave and a nice bath. It looks a lot cleaner and appealing, but I still can't tell if I enjoy the more iconic angular design. Both of these are good, and it wouldn't have a heart attack on the spot if someone used it over the basic model. But it just makes me question why the Nintendo 64 never got a redesign. I can understand why the Sega Saturn skipped out on this one. I can barely even remember what it looked like. But the Nintendo 64 was so wonky looking, but also so basic at the same time. I kind of just wanted to pick a side. So yeah, only one redesign this generation, which is something that surely won't happen again. You've gotta be kidding me. Once again, only Sony was redesigning their console. Nintendo I can understand because you have to keep this thing square. If it wasn't, we'd be living a lie. And Microsoft I can also understand because this was their first console. We need as many of these out in the world as possible. The only redesign this generation was the PS2 Slim. I guess Weight Watchers really does do wonders. The original PS2 was too big, and that's not just me being fat phobic. The PS2 Slim refines it all in a system that's much more reliable and compact. I'd say that this was the first console redesign that actually takes the original and improves on everything it did. The Nes Top Loader was really the only one that came close to something like that, only this one doesn't have RF. If it did, I'd throw it into the open grave in the back. But yeah, there isn't much else to say aside from the fact that this started a revolution. The 7th generation is filled with so many redesigns, starting off with the PS3, the Ps4 Slim. It might sound like the exact same concept as the PS2, and that's because it is. But the PS3 desperately needed this in order to stay afloat. The original PS3 was the most complex thing on the planet. All of these holes and ports had no right being on the system. It made everything both expensive and confusing. So the Ps4 Slim slapped down the price and made everything much easier to understand. I think the best compliment I can give it is that the plastic is nice. However, it did get rid of the PS2 backwards compatibility, which is fine. I don't need Persona 4 in my life anyway. It does still have PS1 backwards compatibility though. Yay. But the Ps4 Super Slim, it isn't that bad of a redesign. I guess they just wanted to push the limits of how small one of these could get. But the Ps4 Slim was already looking healthy and attractive at the time, so this was practically useless, which is the exact opposite of what I can say about the Xbox 360 redesign. The original model was more unreliable than my insurance. It just flat out didn't work. I like its design. I can compliment colors, can't I? But this model failed constantly, resulting in Microsoft putting out this beaut of a system. The Xbox 360S is the reason I'm able to sleep at night. It fixed up all of the original's problems while looking like the coolest thing ever. Overall, Microsoft did a great job redesigning the Xbox 360. Oh no. You had a perfectly good thing going on here, but the Xbox 360e suddenly has the gall to start existing. It's obviously trying to look more like the first Xbox One model, and I already don't like how that thing looks. More on that later. This was pathetic. It functions, but the S will always be the greater one in my heart. Now it's up to Nintendo to hold up the pedestal this generation. I checked the calendar, it is in fact not April Fool's Day. All this one does is strip the console of its GameCube backwards compatibility, and it makes it so it lays on its side. The redesign isn't important in any way or even that interesting. At least the Wii Mini has a great personality. This time, they got rid of the internet access as well. Nobody said Satan was a man. Neither of these deserve to be bought in comparison to the first model, which if anybody asks, I consider it the only model. So if you couldn't tell, this generation was hell-bent on console redesigns. I mean, it can't get crazier than this. This generation was a mix of questionable decisions and a large amount of redesigns, although I wouldn't say it got as wacky or stupid as something like the Wii Mini or PS3 Super Slim. Starting out with the PS4, I quite like the PS4's original design. It has a sleek and classic look that many consoles try to capture but end up looking like a space heater from the future, and as per the running theme of PlayStation redesigns, the Ps4 Slim. I'm a man of symmetry, so you know I'm gonna have a field day complaining about this thing. Functionally, it works. It's a PS4 on a diet, but I just don't like how one sliver is bigger than the other. So thank God there are 3 of them now. The Ps4 Pro is the high-end version of this console, and I think that it looks better than the Slim, if a bit out of place. It's a more powerful PS4, and to them, the only way to get that information across was to add another layer. I feel like the Xbox One had far better redesigns this generation, and they were completely necessary because the original Xbox One was not a great looker. It was all black and no fun. The best thing I can say about it is that I like the vent placement. The Xbox One S in comparison is more functionally sound and it looks a heck of a lot prettier than the original. Something about the nice white color reminds me of an alternate timeline where Microsoft made the Wii, and I'm coming out saying that the vent on the system is even more stylish than the original. Now the Xbox One X looks really good. I think I still prefer the S by a bit, but that isn't to say I don't love how this system looks. It might be all black and in the shape of a box, but I'd say that this box has more heart put into it than this box. And now to the Nintendo Switch. I've been reluctant to call this my favorite console, but I can't ignore the quality and innovation that the system provides, as you can not only play it on the TV, but on the go as well. But what if you could only play it on the go, and the option to play it on the TV was axed entirely? Introducing the Switch Lite. I thought I was speaking hypothetically. The Switch Lite is a purely portable system, and outside of being morally wrong, it's $100 less than the basic model, which makes it worth it if you're only getting the Switch to experience the library for yourself. If you want to play this in multiplayer, 3's a crowd. And I'm gonna have to do the cliche thing and mention how big my hands are and how I find the basic model so much more comfortable to hold. But the Switch Lite didn't cause much of a stir compared to the Switch OLED, and that's not because of what it was, but because of what it wasn't. Around the time, people were clamoring for the release of a more powerful Switch, a Switch Pro if you will, so it would be able to keep up with the next generation of games that were releasing. And what we got was a Switch that had a better screen and some overall improvements. This is $50 more than the basic model, which is fair I suppose. I'm one of the people who didn't mind it much when they announced this instead of the game-changing Switch redesign that would allow it to keep up with the competition, because I feel that Nintendo mostly thrives on their first-party titles. The Switch isn't gonna sell like hotcakes because it has The Witcher 3 now. It's gonna sell because it has games like Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, or Super Mario Odyssey. The only times I wish I had a more powerful Switch are when first-party games themselves are having a hard time running on the system, but those moments are few and far between. But I'm just tired of acting like the Switch needs a high-end version that's monumentally better than the basic model, because at where it stands, the Switch OLED is cool enough to have my respect. But one trend that got its start during this generation was digital-only consoles. The Xbox One has an all-digital edition, and I really don't like the idea of buying digital media if it's physically sound somewhere else. And to remove the feature of buying physical games entirely is a bit stupid to me. They acted like it was this cool new feature too, claiming it to be disc-free gaming for the people that were too scared to go near them. And strangely, this generation is just the beginning in terms of the dawn of digital gaming. The 9th generation hasn't really had any redesigns per se. They were available right out the gate. But the PS5 Digital Edition and the Xbox Series S are digital-only consoles. First talking about the PS5 Digital Edition, this actually looks less awkward than the normal PS5. As I've said, I'm a man of symmetry, which makes me question which one of these was actually designed first. Alright, that's enough for you. And if you're gonna buy one of the two, just get the normal one. If you have enough money to waste on the Digital Edition, chances are you probably have enough money to waste on the basic PS5. At least the Xbox Series S has the courtesy of looking different. I think the Xbox Series X looks a lot more clean, but even though the storage space isn't too large on the Series S, because of how much cheaper it is than the Series X, it has a good reason to be bought in this fashion, unlike the PS5 Digital Edition. So those were all the console redesigns from the 2nd generation to the modern day, but there's still the handhelds. The original Game Boy gave birth to arguably 3 children. The Pocket was a sleek redesign that made the Game Boy look like an actual system and not a power tool. The Game Boy Light was only released in Japan, but it made it so that you could actually see the screen. The Game Boy Color is in the middle of being its own system, but also a part of the original Game Boy's lineage. It has a lot of games made exclusively for the system, and added spices of color to both its own games and other Game Boy titles. But still, the real successor to the Game Boy was the Game Boy Advance, which also arguably arguably had 3 children. The Game Boy Advance did not have a backlight, so even though I think its design is super sleek, you still can't see the screen very well. That's where the Game Boy Advance SP comes in, wearing a clamshell design and a backlight. But if that wasn't enough for you, a revised version of the SP, the AGS 101, had an even better looking backlight. After that, this is adorable. While the Game Boy Micro didn't do great sales-wise, and it could only play Game Boy Advance games, I'd just be willing to buy it because it's more of a novelty, if anything. I'd say, ooh, look at me, I finally found a Game Boy that's smaller than my ego. Getting the PlayStation handhelds out of the way, the PSP had the 2000 and 3000 model, which makes for an exciting game of spot the difference. There was the E1000 model that got rid of a bunch of features including Wi-Fi, yikes. The PSP Go was one of the first purely digital consoles that I can think of, but this was far too ahead of its time, and it was merely laughed at before being discontinued. The PS Vita had a redesign. That's all I'm willing to say about the PS Vita. The DS had quite a few facelifts though. The DS Lite made the DS small and like an actual system, much like the Game Boy Pocket. The DSi got rid of the Game Boy Advance backwards compatibility, but I like the inclusion of the digital shot, the camera, and the feel of the buttons is just a lot more appealing to me. And the DSi XL did everything again, but a bit bigger. And this is the model I definitely grew up with. Now the 3DS is the system with the most redesigns out there. Talk about insecure. The original 3DS is fine, but it could be a bit bigger and do away with the glittery finish. So the 3DS XL in my eyes is the answer to all of my complaints. It even ended up fixing a few other things as well. The new 3DS and new 3DS XL fixed up the systems even more though, adding face tracking 3D, a C-stick, and just being a more solid system in general. The 2DS is where opinions can differ though. It gets rid of 3D and some people find it uncomfortable to hold, but because I've had this thing for so long and my hands are weird, I've always found it comfortable to hold. And mind you, this thing was unbelievably cheap. So what the heck is the new 2DS XL? I think it's fine enough, but this isn't a weird price range. It's for people who want to cheap out, but not cheap out that much. So those were the redesigned consoles that currently exist. They surely evolved over time from being simply a budget version of that console, which is cheaply made and typically inferior, to being an opportunity to improve upon a system's hardware and gimmicks. There are now reasons to get one model over the other, usually. And so I must wrap up my little act by turning this back into a normal SNES. Huh, it didn't work. You know, personally, I blame the government.